thank you everybody for joining us tonight. My name is Jonathan Miller. I'm a general pediatrician at Nemours Children's Health. Um, and we are here to talk to you tonight about what you need to know about COVID-19 vaccine for infants and young kids. And I have to say, as a general pediatrician who's been um, helping my patients and family and friends and colleagues sort of navigate the uncertainty um, and weirdness that has been our pandemic for the past 2.5 years. I am so excited at the prospect that we now have this vaccine available for all of my patients that are going to have this vaccine available to them. And it brings me a lot of optimism. And I truly believe we could never get to a point where we could feel that we're even near sort of a new normal, um, or be able to start to truly talk about rolling back public health measures until all of the segments of our population have had access to this vaccine. And as of this month, we are at that point. Um, and I'm just jazzed up about it. And so I was thrilled when Nemours asked me to play a role in today's webinar, because I think it's so important that our patients and families have the information they need to make a good decision right now, and to understand why now, in at the end of June in 2022, why this is still important for our kids. And so with that, uh, I'd like to go to the next slide. So just a couple things. Questions or comments that we're already going to be rolling with, and as we get some good ones, we will incorporate that. Um, as you can see here, your questions, comments will be visible. They're not anonymous. Try not to include any private health information. And then we will try to get back to people. If we don't get through it tonight in our hour-long webinar, we'll try to get back to you afterwards. Next slide, please. And so I'm pumped about the fact that Nemours spans a big part of the East Coast right now, and we actually have experts coming to you from many of the states that we touch. Dr. Ken Alexander, a pediatric infectious disease specialist, is joining us from our hospital in Orlando, Nemours Children's Hospital, Florida. Dr. Catherine Ely is a general pediatrician in Pennsylvania and Paoli outside of Philadelphia. And I'm a general pediatrician. I practice in Wilmington, Delaware. So we're excited to have this conversation with you all. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Alexander to get us started.
Well, thanks, Jonathan. Hi, Catherine. It's really nice to see you guys, to see my colleagues. And Jonathan, I think your point's good. I really share your enthusiasm. And this COVID pandemic has been hard on everybody. And certainly, as an infectious disease guy, I've lost a lot of sleep over the last 2.5 years, worrying about all this. And the good news is that we've got good news tonight, and we'll sort of talk about it. So let's talk about COVID vaccination in our youngest patients, the kids that are 6 months to 5 years of age. Next slide, please. So let's start with a little bit of terminology just to make sure we're all on the same page, right? So this is a review for most people, but I'll remind you that what we're dealing with is a coronavirus, right? SARS-CoV-2 is a coronavirus. Just, and this is just like saying that, Ken Alexander is in the group of doctor. So SARS-CoV-2 is a coronavirus. They're called coronaviruses because if you look at them under an electron microscope, they've got what looks kind of like radiations or a crown around them. And so that's the Latin term for crown is corona. COVID-19 is the disease caused by the coronavirus SARS-CoV-2. Just like flu is a disease caused by influenza virus. So COVID-19 is the name of the disease, although we sometimes sort of use COVID-19 to talk about the virus as well. And then you'll hear the term variants, right? SARS-CoV-2 variants. What are these? Well, remember that one of the things the virus is trying to do is to copy itself. And when the immune system smartens up and finds ways to shut down the virus changes its clothes. It's a little bit like Carmen Sandiego, right? Once Carmen Sandiego is recognized by everybody, she changes her glasses or her hat or her coat or something like that, so she's no longer so easy to recognize. And that's what the Alpha, Delta, and Omicron variants are. They're just changes in the wardrobe of the virus, so the virus is not sort of recognized by everybody's immune system. This is what viruses do. Coronaviruses are especially good at this, and we're going to see more of this going forward. Next slide. So, children under 5. Why are we talking about vaccinating children under 5? Because really, the good news, especially early in the pandemic, is we didn't see bad disease in children, right? COVID was mostly a disease of old people. And we saw all sorts of terrible stories coming out of nursing homes and hospitals and people's grandparents dying alone. And it was just awful. And we didn't really focus much on kids. But as time has gone on, and as we're seeing more and more of these COVID variants, I think we're actually seeing more disease in children. Now, the good news is the vast majority of children that get COVID-19, especially the young kids, don't get bad disease. And either they don't have much in the way of symptoms, or the symptoms don't really distinguish it from pretty much any other viral infection. What do we see? Well, we see just a lot of kids with an acute febrile illness, maybe the usual boogie nose and a bit of a cough or something like that, but really nothing to distinguish it from any other virus they get at daycare or from their friends or older brother or sister. Now, some of them do get more sick, and we see kids coughing, and they show up just like the little babies with bronchiolitis. And interestingly, over the past year, we've seen kids with croup due to COVID. And you know what those kids look like, right? It's that barky cough. They sound like little seals, and it seems like they're having trouble breathing. In the older kids, we've seen this mysterious inflammatory syndrome, multisystem inflammatory syndrome in children, MISC. And for those kids, this is something that comes on usually weeks to months after they've had their acute COVID. And it's almost like somebody's driving their immune system at 60 miles an hour in first gear. They're just horribly inflamed. They've got abdominal pain and rashes and headaches and trouble with their lungs, and unfortunately, even trouble with their hearts. So many of the sickest kids we've seen have been kids with MISC. And not to spoil the surprise, but it looks like vaccination prevents MISC. And of course, anywhere there's a kid sick with COVID, there's an adult sick with COVID. So what we see is sick kids with sick family members, sick parents, sick grandparents, sick daycare providers, sick school teachers, right? So kids are kind of the canary in the coal mine. And what we're now seeing more of, we think, is that kids that have had COVID are at risk for bacterial infections after they've had COVID. They've had COVID pneumonia, and then as a complication, they may end up with bacterial pneumonia. This is kind of a new area, so watch this space. Next slide. The big thing is COVID's not really as benign in kids as we would like it to be. Now, yes, again, the majority of kids get it and they do just fine. But realize that it's so common now that COVID now sits as among the 5 leading causes of death in children between March 1 of 2020 and last April. Now, it's not at the top of the list. That's still accidents, motor vehicle accidents, guns, and all those things. But you can see here in the list that there are 134 families that have lost a child due to COVID-19. And I actually know one of them. And it's a horrible, horrible thing. Next slide. Again, it turns out that if you look at it in the spectrum of diseases against which we vaccinate, COVID's actually more common than some of the diseases that you and I regularly vaccinate for, right? When rubella was running around, we only lost about 17 kids a year due to rubella. When varicella was bad, when chickenpox was floating around before we vaccinated, we had about 15 or 16 kids between the ages of 5 and 9 die of chickenpox every year. And you can sort of look down the list and realize that we've been vaccinating for diseases that cause a lot less mortality than what we're seeing with COVID right now. So it really does up the ante on the fact that COVID vaccine is at least as important and maybe more important than some of the other vaccines that we're now giving. Next slide. And so you can see here, COVID infection, COVID disease is not uncommon. We've had more than 500,000 cases among children less than 12 months. And again, those are the cases that have been recognized, and almost 2 million among children 12 months to 4 years of age. So it's not a rare disease. And about 8,500 kids have had this multi-system inflammatory syndrome. Now, again, those tend to be the older kids, most commonly the teenagers, but among those, 70 of those kids have died. So that's nothing to sniff at. Next slide. Medical conditions associated with severe COVID, because it turns out that for the average kid, as we've talked about, COVID may not be that severe, but there are groups of kids that do get into trouble. Now, we've talked some about that already. We know adults get into trouble with severe COVID, especially as they get older. But among young people, obesity is a big problem. The obese teenager or the obese younger child is set up for bad COVID. Now, if you can explain why, I'll get you into the National Academy of Sciences, but it's clearly a problem. Kids with diabetes, kids with asthma. Now, that's not a surprise, right? Kids with asthma get bad flu, they get other bad respiratory infections, and they do get bad COVID. Similarly, kids with congenital heart disease are at risk for severe COVID. Kids with genetic disorders, and kids with disorders that affect the central nervous system and metabolism. Again, these are kids we're used to seeing have bad disease, and indeed that's exactly what we're seeing. And then, for reasons that none of us really knows very well, we seem to be seeing more severe disease in Hispanic and African American kids. And again, if you can explain why that is, you'll be famous. But it's clear this virus is just really hard on those kids. Next slide. So at that point, I'd like to turn it over to Catherine because she's a real pediatrician. Catherine, tell me, what do you do? What do you want to tell a parent if you think a child might have COVID-19?
So we get calls about this pretty much every day, like all day long, especially during some of the surges. And in general, for most people, I tell them in general, in terms of helping with the symptoms and treatments for COVID, it's similar to other viral illnesses that we deal with. So making your child comfortable, Tylenol, ibuprofen, making sure they're drinking fluids well, honey if they have a cough, humidifiers, all the same things we do for other colds. That being said, in many cases, we would recommend testing for COVID just to confirm so that if kids have COVID, we can make sure that they isolate and don't spread to other people in the community. And then, of course, I always talk about kind of what to watch for and what we'd be most concerned about, which would be if kids were having trouble breathing, if they were refusing to eat or drink, and weren't staying well hydrated, if they urinate less than 3 times in a 24-hour period, if they, as it mentions on this slide, if they seem confused, if they look pale or blue in color, or if they're so sleepy it's difficult to wake them up. And then, so in general, if there's any concerns, I would recommend people call their pediatrician. But for the most part, treat it like other illnesses, but it is important, I think, to identify it with testing if possible, so that you can know your child has it or has had it in case there are complications down the road, and also so kids can isolate and avoid spreading it to others in the community.
So I put this slide into the deck just so people can see some sources where to get good information about COVID and COVID vaccines. The CDC's got some really good information for us. And so if you just fire up your browser and you put in CDC and COVID vaccines for young children, this is where you go. And what this actually is the original media statement from a couple of days ago. I think it was June 19th, with the really good news that the CDC has recommended vaccines for young children. Now, just so people understand the pathway that a vaccine takes, it's important to understand all the people that have to look at things and approve it. So Jonathan, let's say that three of us invent a COVID vaccine today. So the first thing we're going to do, right, is check it in animals to make sure it's safe there. And then we're going to get a very small group of people, always adults, and we're going to give them a dose of that vaccine to see if it's safe in adults. That's a phase 1 study. And it might only be 10 or 12 people just to see that the vaccine doesn't hurt anybody. A phase 2 study is where we take a larger group, now maybe 100 people, and give them doses of vaccine to make sure we can find the right dose to get the right effect. Then the third stage is what's called a phase 3 study, and that's the study where we get perhaps thousands of people to actually show that the vaccine really works. You give the vaccine to some people, you give placebo to others, and you do a blinded study to see that the vaccine prevents disease in the people who are vaccinated. Once you show your vaccine works, and once you demonstrate that your vaccine is safe, you go to the Food and Drug Administration, the FDA, and they look at all your data and they say, does it work? Is it safe? If the answer to both of those questions is yes, then they'll say you may market this vaccine. At this point, the vaccine then goes to the Centers for Disease Control, to the Advisory Committee on Immunization Practices. And that's kind of the global brain trust around vaccines. And the Advisory Committee on Immunization Practices looks at that vaccine and says, the FDA says we can use it. Now we're going to tell you how we want you to use it. And so when the ACIP weighs in and the CDC approves it, that's when you and I, as pediatricians, get the green light to vaccinate. So there's lots of people reviewing the data and weighing in. Next slide. So let's take a look at this a little bit and talk about how mRNA vaccines work. Now, many of you may have seen this already, but this is a little clip I found from the PBS NewsHour, and this is a really nice story about how mRNA vaccines work. And the important thing here is what we're making is spike protein, which is the protein that the virus has on its surface that the virus uses to get into our cells. And we know from animal research that if you can make antibodies against spike protein, you can prevent COVID infection.
U.S. authorization of 2 COVID-19 vaccines marked a turning point in the pandemic and vaccine science. These vaccines use messenger RNA, or mRNA, to deliver immunity. mRNA are short strands of instructions used to build proteins. It's impossible for these mRNA vaccines to alter our DNA in any way. Although that technology has been in development for decades, mRNA vaccines hadn't made it to market until now. There are a few ways to make a vaccine. Most use a version of the pathogen they are trying to protect you against, like the flu or measles, to trigger an immune response. You can think of vaccines like a biological wanted poster. They show our bodies how to recognize the enemy, an antigen such as a harmful virus or bacteria, so we know how to react if it ever shows up. Our bodies will be prepared to send T cells to attack infected cells, and B cells to produce antibodies, which neutralize the virus and prevent it from invading healthy cells. mRNA vaccines use innovative technology to deliver protection. If traditional vaccines deliver wanted posters, these vaccines carry USB drives with instructions that tell our cellular machinery how to print its own poster. In other words, they instruct the body to make its own antigens. In the case of the coronavirus, the antigen is the infamous spike protein that attaches to and infects your cells. These vaccines use mRNA, a molecule that our cells need to create any type of protein to introduce us to that spike. To start, researchers isolated the part of the coronavirus's genetic sequence that codes for the spike protein. Then, they put an mRNA molecule containing the code into a super tiny drug delivery system known as a lipid nanoparticle, which can enter our cells. Inside the cell, ribosomes use the code to create a protein chain that resembles the enemy, the coronavirus's spike protein. Those cells can then temporarily display a lookalike of that protein, which prompts our immune cells to respond as if it were an antigen from a traditional vaccine.
So one of the interesting things to me, and I know Jonathan and Catherine, you both heard it, is people will say, well, it's not natural. You know, in many ways, using messenger RNA is about the most natural way to get immunity because your body's actually making the vaccine using the very mechanisms that nature gave us to make proteins. So I think this is just incredibly cool. Next slide. So what are the vaccine schedules? Here, the thing I want you to keep in mind is that there are slight differences between the Pfizer vaccine and the Moderna vaccine, and that's because of the way they did their clinical trials. For the Pfizer vaccine, they've got approval for 6 months to 4 years. And what they've got approved is a 3-dose regimen. So you'll give a child the first dose, a second dose 3 to 8 weeks later, and then a third dose, sometimes referred to as the booster dose, 8 weeks after that. And once you've done that, you've given that child sort of the Cadillac of protection against COVID-19. Next slide. Moderna's vaccine, right now, Moderna only has approval for 2 doses. They are doing their third dose study now. But what you can do is give a child your first dose and then a second dose 4 weeks to 8 weeks later. Again, Moderna's not yet approved for a third dose. Now, is there any reason to think that one schedule or one vaccine is better than another? Right now, we don't have any data to suggest that one setup is better than the other. And either one you pick is certainly a heck of a lot better than no protection whatsoever. So would I hold out for one or the other? No, I'd reach for the first vaccine that my kid could get. Next slide. Catherine, you want to talk about side effects?
Sure. In general, the side effects for kids in this age group have been pretty mild. In our office, we just started vaccinating for this age group on Saturday, so I don't have a lot of personal experience, but we did vaccinate many kids in the older age group, the 5 to 12 age group. And they also had pretty low rates of side effects. In general, many kids have some tiredness, drowsiness, tenderness or redness around the shot site, fussiness for the younger kids. But we're actually looking at pretty low rates. So I think for the Pfizer vaccine, it was under 10% of kids got fevers. And for the Moderna vaccine, it was a little bit higher, but not much, maybe like 16%. And these are for the kids under age 5. So pretty low, especially compared to many other vaccines that we give. Some of the vaccines have up to 25 or 30% chance of having fever after them. The most common side effects were, I think, drowsiness, irritability for the younger kids. I think tiredness and soreness for the older kids, and I think headache for Moderna for the slightly older kids, like the kids 2 to 5. And I think, and even then we're looking at maybe like 50% of kids, which means 50% of kids may not have any side effects at all. So overall, the rates are low. There were no deaths in the study group that were attributed to the vaccine. There were no rates of myocarditis or any serious inflammatory conditions that we know of. There was one febrile seizure, I believe, after the Moderna vaccine. And then there were a few cases of swollen lymph nodes, I think, after the Pfizer vaccine. But for the most part, there were really no major complications so far that have been highlighted for this younger age group. And most of the reactions are mild, go away in a day or two, and even many kids don't even get those.
So one of the important questions is, and lots of people ask, who should not receive COVID vaccines? Jonathan, what are you telling folks in your office in terms of who shouldn't get vaccinated?
So, well, really, it's what you have on the screen there. So it's anybody who's had an allergic reaction to a previous COVID vaccine or a component of the COVID vaccine, or if they're less than 6 months old.
You know, and this is important because this is a question I'm getting a lot. And lots of parents appropriately are saying, well, my child's allergic to eggs, or my child has a food allergy, or my child's allergic to this or that, or my child has ADD or a seizure disorder or something like that. Are any of these things true contraindications to vaccination? And the answer is no. That in fact, you can see here that the real contraindications to vaccination is if a child's had a severe allergic reaction to a dose in the past, or if you know the child to be allergic to a component in the vaccine. And in that case, it's extremely rare. So what really worries me is that, people who are saying, well, my kid has an egg allergy, I'm not going to vaccinate him. That makes me think that you're depriving your child of protection for no good reason whatsoever. There's no evidence that egg allergy, food allergy, animal dander, any kind of allergies are associated with an increased rate of COVID-19 reactions. And so the true contraindications are right there, severe allergic reactions to the vaccine itself.
And I would chime in that I believe there were no cases anaphylaxis to the vaccines in the studies for this age group thus far. So, and so I'm not aware of any so far severe allergic reactions being reported.
Yeah, as I recall, Catherine, the rate of anaphylaxis is something like 5 per million or something like that. It's incredibly low. So here's some more information where people can look at information for vaccination of COVID-19 for both children and for teenagers, because of course, many of the folks that are tuned in have got kids of different ages. So again, more really good information from the CDC. There was an interesting question. Can the COVID vaccine cause a false positive COVID test? And the answer is, well, if you're doing the nasal test, no, it can't cause a false positive. If somebody's doing a blood test to look for COVID antibodies, then maybe yes, the vaccine will give you antibodies against spike protein. So that could be a false positive. But for the kind of testing you and I do in the office, no, the vaccine can't cause a false positive test.
Awesome. So we're getting some amazing questions in Q&A, but before we get to all of them, or as many as we can, I'm going to ask Dr. Ely to spend a little time talking about the primary care perspective on the vaccine.
So I'm going to talk both a little bit about primary care perspective and my own perspective in terms of making these decisions for my own kids. So just a little background about myself. That's my daughter, Lily, getting her first COVID vaccine, by the way. And little shout out if she's watching. Happy half birthday. But I trained at Seattle Children's Hospital for residency and practiced out in Washington State for a long time. And I think out there in general, there's sort of a lower intervention philosophy. And so that's where really how I come to my practice is sort of, don't do things that are unnecessary. And so I really look at every decision for my patients and for my kids about the risk benefit ratio. And do I think that there's a clear benefit for kids, to my own kids or my patients, to do a certain intervention, whether it's vaccines, medications, anything like that. And so my kids are 5 years old and 7 years old. My daughter there is 7. And that was her getting her vaccine at, I think, one of the very first vaccine clinics that Nemours offered, the first week that it was approved. My son just turned 5 in April, and he got his vaccine within a week of turning 5. And excuse me. And both of them were very excited to get their vaccines and went around and told all their teachers. They came in, they were very excited. It was a happy day for everything, for everyone. My daughter, we got called because they had extra doses available. She had come from a soccer game and she wanted to go right over. I'll talk a little bit about how I've fostered that in my house to help make kind of vaccines a positive thing instead of a negative thing. I also kind of related to that, like everyone else has mentioned during this talk so far, I'm really excited that the vaccine is approved for the younger kids. It's been a long time coming, and I know pretty much every other pediatrician I know, every other doctor I know is excited. Many of the first patients of mine that got vaccinated were kids of doctors. I could always tell, like, our first vaccine clinic, I'd see a lot of like the kids of the OB-GYNs and people who I know in the community kind of walked in, and of course I was seeing them. And so I think there is a lot of excitement in the medical field about, or in the medical parent world of getting their own kids vaccinated. Both my kids now are fully vaccinated. My daughter just had her booster as well. Again, so I just want to talk a little bit about sort of how I think through the risk benefit ratio and why I'm excited about my kids getting vaccinated and my patients getting vaccinated. I think a lot of the information that I think through we've already talked about, or Dr. Alexander kind of hit on. So just kind of to loop back to some of the things that he said. So I think over 2 million kids under age 5 have had COVID so far in the US, at least as of last week, I think. And overwhelmingly, they do well. We've seen many, many patients in my practice who had COVID, and most do fine. And when parents call worried or upset or nervous, whether they have underlying medical problems or not, a lot of the time I can reassure them that, chances are kids are going to be fine who get COVID. But they aren't all fine, as we talked about earlier, and there are serious complications that happen from COVID, and many like Dr. Alexander talked about, there's really a higher rate of serious complications with COVID, including death, than almost all of the vaccine preventable diseases that we vaccinate against. And so in my mind, early on, when I thought of COVID, I sort of thought of it for young kids as compared to the flu. And I thought initially, like, flu, and I said this to many patients, like, it seems like flu might be worse for kids than COVID. The kids are doing fine. I've seen lots of kids with the flu who were hospitalized. I've seen kids die with the flu. I went through the swine flu pandemic as an intern in Seattle, and kids were just overwhelmed with sick kids in ICUs and everywhere during that time. And so in my mind, flu is sort of a common illness that goes around every year that can affect kids a lot. And at first it seemed like COVID really, for kids, fortunately, was maybe not as bad as the flu. And so that was a real relief early on. But as we've seen over the past year with the Omicron variant, that really is no longer proving to be the case. And the rates of hospitalization for kids with COVID since Omicron started, have reached or surpassed the rates of hospitalization for kids with the flu in the years before COVID, or at least the few years before, I think 2017 and beyond. And like we already talked about, although there are not many kids who've died from COVID, there are enough. And any deaths in this young age group under age 5 that can be prevented, I think are obviously worthwhile. And so for that reason, I'm excited that the vaccine is out. Of course, then so I mentioned risk benefit ratio. So talked a little bit about the risk of COVID, which isn't super high, but still a real risk to kids. I forgot to mention also over 50% of kids who've been hospitalized with COVID had no known underlying medical problems. So although there are a lot of medical issues that can increase your risk with COVID that Dr. Alexander talked about, many of the kids who had serious complications did not have any underlying issues. And so healthy kids can get hit really hard by COVID. So that's the risk of getting COVID. The other side of things is the risks of getting the vaccine. And from what I can see, the risks are really low, much lower than the risks of getting COVID, at least from everything we know so far. And so, like I said earlier, there have not been any deaths associated with getting the vaccine in this age group. And there have been no cases of myocarditis. There have been no major issues. I'm not aware of anything that required hospitalization from the vaccine thus far in this age group. And in general, the side effects, like I already talked about, are mild, and often it seems like lower rates of side effects than many of the vaccines that I give every day to kids of all ages. And so that to me is really reassuring. I know myself and a lot of other families worry, could there be complications of the vaccine that we don't know about, or adverse events that are going to come up, sort of like what happened with the myocarditis that was uncovered later for older kids when more people got the vaccine. And I absolutely think that that's true. It's possible that we'll uncover things as more kids get vaccinated, and and we're going to watch very closely over the next few months as thousands or millions of kids get this vaccine. But I think the chance is low that there's going to be anything really serious. Even the myocarditis was rare and very mild. The kids usually recovered quickly. Most did not require any serious intervention or hospitalization. And that in particular seemed to be hopefully just an issue, or more likely to be an issue for older kids. And I think it's unlikely that that will come out. And either way, to me, it feels like even if there's something unanticipated that comes up, the chance that that's going to happen is much lower than the risks of getting COVID right now for kids. And I also worry about things down the line that COVID can cause. There's been definitely concerning reports about higher rates of type 1 diabetes in kids who've had COVID. There's some effects possibly on brain aging and things like that. And I worry about what COVID how it could impact kids' health as they get older. And I think it's more likely that COVID itself will cause long-term issues or problems down the road than the vaccine will, at least from everything I know so far. And so that's how I sort of think about it. And that's why I was happy and excited to get my own kids vaccinated. And I think that's why they were excited to get vaccinated. And I think I think it's important how we frame it for our kids. And since my kids were young, since they were getting their first vaccines, I always really tried to tie the vaccination with something happy or exciting. I tried, as soon as I felt like they were old enough to understand how vaccines work in a very basic way, I talked about it. I usually try not to hide that we're going to get a vaccine or surprise them. I try to be open about it. And starting at a very young age, and maybe others will disagree with me on this, but my kids get a reward when they get a vaccine. Nowadays, they get to go to a store and pick a small toy at a very nominal price. And honestly, because of that, they've become very excited about the vaccines. Plus, over time, they've come to understand how vaccines help them, and they don't like being sick. And we talk about how it can avoid that. And so my kids are very happy to get vaccinated. They come in willingly. They sit there. Sometimes they might cry briefly if it hurts, but it's really usually a happy experience. And so I recommend sort of similar approach for other kids. It does not have to be a monetary reward or something that costs money. It could be you get to, after the vaccine, spend time at the park with daddy, or mom's gonna, leave work early to take you to the doctor, and then we can, play together or something like that. But I think really trying to make it as positive as possible and trying to be open and not sneak things on kids is important, even starting at a very young age, even if they don't quite get it, but starting very basic. And so I think that's all that I wanted to say. I know there's many questions, so why don't we, oh yes, and this is a slide about some reliable places that you can go for information. As Dr. Alexander mentioned, the cdc.gov website always has tons of information. The Immunization Action Coalition also has lots of useful information. Kidshealth.org through Nemours has information about all kinds of medical issues. And then there's a few other things there. The American Academy of Pediatrics and the American Academy of Family Physicians and the World Health Organization are all reliable resources that I think are good places to look instead of just a random Google search, which sometimes provides these days a lot of fake news.
Awesome. Well, thank you, Dr. Alexander and Dr. Ely, for that review. And we are getting so many good questions that I kind of like. I want to be able to get to as many as we can right now. And before I get to them, I kind of want to address one that just came through, and I'm going to take one because this is sort of part of the spiel that I often have with families. But the question is like, people are still getting COVID and they're still getting sick and they're still spreading it despite the vaccine. So like, why should we still be doing it? I think that's the question that everybody should be asking themselves. It's the right question, right? But what you need to understand is that the vaccine does decrease your chance of getting COVID. You can still get COVID, and none of our vaccines are 100% effective, although some get close. You can definitely still get COVID, but it decreases your chance of getting it. It decreases your chance of spreading it. But most importantly, the reason why we're seeing less hospitalizations and less death across our country right now, and it feels like COVID is better and it feels like COVID isn't as severe, is because of the vaccine, as well as some of our treatments now for COVID, right? And we see that time and time again, every study. The people who are getting hospitalized and dying are the ones who are unvaccinated. The other thing we know about the vaccine is that it has shown that it prevents against future variants better than getting COVID or not getting the vaccine, right? So getting the vaccine definitely helps against future variant. And what we've learned over the last 2.5 years is that the next variant is like 3 to 6 months around the corner, and we can't predict it. And each variant, from my perspective, has seemed to impact kids a little bit more than the one before, or a little bit differently. And so the best thing you can do for your child right now on June 28th, is to get the vaccine, because it's going to take some time and a few doses before it builds up immunity, and school starts in a few months, and the next variant is just around the corner. And so people are asking if they should wait till fall, and the answer is no. You don't want to wait till fall to start the vaccine series. And if your kid is 4 and you're worried about waiting till 5, don't wait till 5. We want you to get the vaccine right now, whether it's the lower infant dose or even if it's the end of June. Now is important. And it's important for your family, it's important for your kids to get the vaccine. And I want you to ask yourself, what is the thing you want your child to be exposed to? A vaccine that has been well studied and refined and does what it's purported to do and has shown no serious or long-term side effects, or the virus itself, which keeps changing, keeps throwing, curveballs at us. It's totally unpredictable, definitely causes serious and long-term side effects, and affects the heart. There's a lot of questions about the heart, affects the heart way more than the vaccine has shown that it does. And also, COVID causes fevers way more than the vaccine has shown, right? So people are asking about febrile seizures, asking about things like that. If you're worried about febrile seizures, I want you to get the vaccine so you're not going to get COVID, which is going to trigger febrile seizures. So, um, I tried to just get a lot of the questions just in one little spurt there. But I feel, as you can tell, pretty passionately about this. And I think you really need to weigh the risks and benefits, as Dr. Ely said. And the risk is COVID virus. It's not the side effects of the vaccine. The benefit are the benefits of the vaccine and what it does to protect you against COVID virus. So I'll stop there. And I want to get to some of the questions that have come up over and over again. And so one of them is, my kid has COVID now. When should I get the vaccine?
So I'll start with that one. Turns out, since coronaviruses were first described back in the 1960s and 70s, one of the things we learned is you could get coronavirus and then get it again. Our immune systems aren't very smart when it comes to coronaviruses, and coronaviruses themselves are pretty smart at avoiding the immune system. So we think that natural infection protects you for about 3 months. So the recommendation has been that if your kids had the acute infection, you can wait as long as 3 months before you vaccinate them. Now, do you have to wait 3 months? No. Get them to the doctor when you're ready and go.
Awesome. And then a lot of folks are asking sort of where to get the vaccine. And I think sort of generically, we have people coming from all over the country here, so it's hard to speak state by state. But a lot of us leaned on pharmacies for the older patients. What is your guidance for, kids who are 6 months, a year old, as far as where to find the vaccine?
So I can talk about sort of our region here. I don't know as much about Florida. I saw a lot of questions coming in about how difficult it was to find vaccines in Florida. So I might let Dr. Alexander speak to that. But around here, there are many pediatrician offices are offering the vaccine, including, I believe, all the Nemours primary care practices, but many others as well. Not all, but many. Some private pediatrician offices are also offering them to other patients, not their own patients. And some local pharmacies are also offering it, especially for the older kids. I believe kids under 3 and sometimes under 18 months, it's even harder to find places, but I guess in general, I would I would recommend calling your pediatrician, and I hope that they have the pulse on your local region and where best to get in.
So as many of you appreciate, in Florida, things are a little complicated around COVID vaccination for young kids. The good news here is that the pediatric community, both your private pediatricians and Nemours, is moving on this. And I would anticipate that Nemours will be offering vaccination for young kids in the next week to 2 weeks. Watch this space. Otherwise, our pharmacies are certainly beginning to step up, and so there likely to be many options. It's just developing now.
Okay. And it is complicated right now as far as how to get it and where to get it. And one thing I would say is, if you're trying to and you're frustrated, well, thank you for trying to get it, because I have a lot of concern about the people who aren't even trying to get it. And be patient, because it's going to become accessible to you. Sometimes the first couple weeks of our rollouts at every age group has been frustrating, um, and so please be patient. There have been a lot of questions, and we're gonna take a detour for a couple minutes to talk about the sort of dosing around the pediatric vaccinations. there's questions about the small dose for under 5, how it differs from adult dosing, how it differs from Pfizer and Moderna, 2 shots, 3 shots. Can you give a little guidance and understanding for everybody so that they understand the nuances of the dosing?
Yeah, so let me start with that one. We do give lower doses of the messenger RNA to young kids, but it's not because the messenger RNA is too much for young kids. The reason we give the lower dose to young kids is because young kids actually have a better immune response. So young kids get the same antibody response as adults do with a much lower dose of vaccine. And this is actually common among many vaccines. So we can give kids a lower dose and hopefully have fewer side effects because kids' immune systems actually respond to the vaccine better. Now, why the differences in schedule and dose between Moderna and Pfizer? Well, part of it is because while the vaccines are both messenger RNAs that make spike protein, they're different, right? It's a little bit like, well, maybe bigger differences than Coke and Pepsi, but you get the idea that they're not exactly the same. But they do make the spike protein. And so they do respond a little bit differently in the tissues. But the real goal is look at the antibody levels that people make. And it turns out that young kids do really, really well. So kids do great because their immune systems are smarter than ours as adults.
And what are your predictions about future need for booster doses above the 2 and 3 doses currently recommended for Moderna and Pfizer? New vaccines for variants in the future? Are we going to be giving this every year like the flu shot? Sort of what should people start to prepare for down the line?
So I wish I had that crystal ball, Jonathan. That's a great question. But you really hit the nail on the head when you said this virus, these variants keep cropping up. So the vaccines that we are giving now are actually vaccines directed against that original Wuhan strain virus. Doesn't work quite as well against Delta, doesn't work quite as well against Omicron. And this is why these companies are now testing Omicron vaccines. And so we'll always be playing catch up to some degree. And this is why we may need to have booster doses against the different variants. And that's the cool thing about the mRNA vaccines. If this were a protein vaccine, it would take you 3 to 5 years to create a new vaccine. With the mRNA vaccines, they can literally do it and test it in months. So I would anticipate that we will be giving more of these vaccines, especially until more of the world is immune to the virus. And as the rest of the world gets vaccinated and becomes immune, then we'll see fewer variants cropping up.
And I think
Dr. Ely? Yeah.
related to that, I just want to say, I think a lot of people are asking if they should wait until a newer one comes out. I would say it's probably a long while down the road, just like we've seen it took a long time for these vaccines to come out, especially for the younger age group. I would not wait. And if a vaccine that matches the current strains comes out later, that could always be given on top of it, is my understanding. And so I don't think there'd be a reason at this point to wait and hope that there's going to be something better soon that comes around. I think it's better to get the protection you can now and then kind of hone that protection or improve it later as other vaccines become available.
Thank you. Um, let's turn now and talk a little bit about the sort of cardiac manifestations. There have been a number of questions in the chat, either about a child who has a congenital heart problem like a VSD, or about concern for the vaccine causing carditis or inflammation of the heart. Can you speak, a little bit about what we know about this? How safe is it? And what do we know about that specific side effect as it relates to infants and toddlers?
Yeah. Great question. And I think you're right. This is a key issue for lots of parents. So what we saw when the vaccines first came out and we started vaccinating young men, And this is typically late adolescents, early adolescent men, that in a very small proportion of these young men, we saw inflammation either of the heart muscle or the tissue around the heart, the pericardium. And so you heard the terms like myocarditis and pericarditis. This was something seen almost exclusively in young men and almost always with the second dose. Now, the good news is this: these young men had symptoms, but they were mild and usually were gone within 1 or 2 days. And they responded to things like ibuprofen. Now, the rate of this was somewhere around 2 to 3 cases per 100,000 days in the week after people were vaccinated. So it was very, very rare. And to calibrate that for you, the rate of heart inflammation in kids with acute COVID is around a third, and the rate of heart inflammation in kids with MIS-C is around 2/3. So way more myocarditis in infection and in MIS-C. So for kids, again, your risk with vaccines is much, much lower. Now, people will also ask, I've got a kid with a congenital heart defect. And here we keep in mind that kids with congenital heart defects are at increased risk for severe COVID. There's no indication that they're at increased risk for myocarditis or pericarditis. So in fact, the fear of myocarditis or pericarditis should not keep you from vaccinating your kid with tricuspid atresia or a bicuspid aortic valve or anything like that. In fact, those cardiac defects should encourage you to vaccinate those kids.
So beyond that discussion about cardiac manifestations, are there any serious long-term side effects or impacts on development or fertility that you're aware of associated with this vaccine?
Vaccines make adults.
Okay. And I will second that. There's been pretty good data now in the like billions of humans who've been getting these vaccines. And there really aren't any serious long-term side effects in children. Right. And no concerns about fertility. And I know that's still on some parents' minds. And
And
so,
nobody's seen any myocarditis stuff in the young kids, right? Now, where are we? As was pointed out, we've vaccinated now probably, I don't know, many thousands of little kids. So far, nobody's seen any myocarditis or pericarditis in the young kids. It's in the older teenage boys.
um, so well, there's so many good questions. We only have a few minutes left, so I want to make sure I get to some of the really good ones. So, knowing so there's some high risk conditions that people have asked about. I want to get this one real quick. So premature people, people with seizures, people with immunodeficiencies, what is your recommendation around giving the vaccine to them?
Catherine, you want to start?
Sure. I think it goes links in very nicely to the talk about kids with congenital heart diseases. All these kids who have underlying medical conditions are more likely to have severe illness with COVID. And I am not aware of any concerns of higher risk of side effects or adverse reactions to the vaccine, but I am aware of a higher risk if they actually get COVID. And as far as we know, and what we've seen for older kids with this vaccine and adults, that people with underlying medical problems who get COVID, who've had the vaccine, are less likely to have those serious complications. And I think there'd be I can't think of anything besides an allergic reaction to the actual vaccine that any other prior known medical problem that would make me not want to vaccinate a child. And in fact, all of those medical problems, I would much prefer the kid have the vaccine than not have the vaccine.
Awesome. Um, I'm going to ask one more question and then we'll maybe get to some final thoughts, if that's okay. Different versions of this question have come up, and it really has to do with sort of the research that got us here, the approval process, the differences between Pfizer and Moderna, you know, sort of how can we reassure people that it's been studied appropriately and the approval was not rushed for children this age, that both vaccines are appropriate, because some of our practices have tried to get both vaccines and the state's given us what they give us, right? So if we have Pfizer, we have Pfizer. If we have Moderna, we have Moderna. you know I know you touched on this earlier, Dr. Alexander, but maybe a little bit more on the approval process and the differences.
Yeah. So again, I think both vaccines have gone through very rigorous approval, and we're not done yet, right? We have in the United States the most rigorous vaccine safety monitoring system in the world, bar none. And so we continue to watch, we continue to look for problems, and we report them when we see them. And the good news now is that every day there's thousands and thousands of more people that are getting vaccinated. I always laugh that people say, well, I don't want to be a guinea pig. Well, the answer is in the United States, you'd probably be what, guinea pig 500 million in the number of doses we've given? That ain't a guinea pig anymore. That's a lot of experience with vaccines.
And I'd rather be a vaccine guinea pig than a COVID disease guinea pig, right? Like, you're going to be a guinea pig of one or the other. And so I like the smart scientists personally. Um, so I just want to address one question that just came through at the end, because I think it's a good one about like turning towards a new normal. And it's, should we keep our family quarantined after the vaccine, or is it finally safe to go out? Or are we doing them a disservice by sending them to school? And this is something I think we've all wrestled with, whether it has to do with going back to work or going back to the supermarket, or when you stop wearing your mask or go to restaurants or send your kids to school or camp or what have you. I mean, this is part of like everything we do. This kind of calculations have to be running through our mind. And I led with this. I think the fact that this vaccine is now accessible to all of our populations in the United States that are going to be accessible to this vaccine, and they're all, some people are getting it now and then they need their booster dose in a few weeks and then maybe another one a few weeks. So like full immunity isn't going to be there for a few months. Um, but to me, we're at a place where things are going to be safer. They're going to be safer for your kids who've been vaccinated. They're going to be safer just for everybody who've had the virus and have had the vaccine. And we know how to handle it better. And I think testing is a little bit more accessible. Although don't trust the rates of disease you're hearing out there. Like, I don't know anybody who's getting the PCR tests as commonly as as the home tests, and the home tests aren't reported, right? So like, we are still seeing a ton of COVID right now. If you think there's not a lot of COVID, there is. You're just not seeing it in the numbers. Sorry, little sidetrack there.
Yeah, I got 4 kids in the hospital right now with COVID.
Those are being reported though, right? Because you're getting a PCR. But I had 8 people in my family in April who had COVID, and they were all home tests and none got reported, right? So either way. So my point is, I don't think you're doing your child a disservice if you start to send them back to normal activities again. I still think it's important to be smart, and I still think it's important to pay attention to local spread, geographic spread. Things might change in August or September or October. And so, letting them do things now or sending them to school without a mask or to camp without a mask now isn't necessarily the same decision that you should make in October. You need to keep your eyes and ears open. But I do not think you're doing them a disservice. I think we are at a point now where you really can feel more confident allowing them to return to some normal things. So I'm going to let that be my final thought. And I'm going to open it up for final thoughts. Maybe first, Dr. Ely.
So I guess linking in with that, I think of things all the time in risk benefit ratios. And I think at this point, if your kids are vaccinated and you're vaccinated, I think you've done, everything you can to prevent serious illness. And it's important for kids to get back into schools and activities and all the things that they may not have done as much of over the past few years. And so I think at this point, the benefit of kids getting back into all the activities they want to do once they're vaccinated outweighs the risk of serious illness, especially after having the vaccine. And so I just would go back to that risk benefit ratio and think about that for your individual child. And if you're not sure, ask your pediatrician and talk it through with them. But the vast majority of the time, I think it's a strong, the risk benefit ratio strongly tilts towards vaccination in this case.
So I look at it like this, Jonathan, that parents all want to do the right thing, right? We all are doing our darndest to do the right thing for our kids. And here you got to trust your gut. I'm fully vaccinated. My wife is fully vaccinated. My parents, my kids, when I talk to my nieces and nephews, they're fully vaccinated. My nephew and my niece both called me. They've got young kids and said, can we finally get them vaccinated? I said, go for it. So young kids are being vaccinated. You know, vaccination is what you do for the people you love. I sort of joke with our house staff the other day. I said, only vaccinate the children you love. But in a way, that's very serious about that, right? As pediatricians, and I see Catherine smiling especially, parents come to you saying, I love my child, help me love my child. And what you and I do, the three of us do as pediatricians, is we say, we want to help you love your child, vaccinate them.
Okay, well, thank you. Sorry, I had to get off mute. So just wanted to make sure everybody's aware, Nemours Children's Health System, where we all work, is a pretty large system on the East Coast. We have 2 children's hospitals, one in Wilmington, one in Orlando, and lots of specialists and primary care docs who love all of our patients. So please go to nemours.org if you want to learn more about us, or kidshealth.org, where we have a lot of really great patient-friendly information, both about COVID vaccine, or any other children's health topic you're interested in. Next slide. And thank you all for joining tonight. We appreciate it.